On April 1st, 1945, 180,000 American soldiers landed on the beaches of Okinawa expecting another Iwo Jima massacre, but instead found empty sand and eerie silence in what seemed like a miracle until the next 82 days proved it was a trap that would kill 150,000 civilians, 12,500 Americans, and over 100,000 Japanese soldiers in the deadliest battle of the Pacific War. The beaches were completely undefended. No machine guns fired from hidden bunkers, and American troops walked inland standing upright as if on a training exercise, capturing 2 major airfields and pushing miles into the island while suffering only 28 casualties on the first day, leading many soldiers to joke that this invasion felt more like a picnic than the apocalyptic battle they had been promised after the nightmare of Iwo Jima just weeks earlier. But the eerie silence was not a Japanese mistake or a stroke of good fortune, but rather a deliberate strategy, because General Ushijima Mitsuru, commander of the 32nd Japanese Army with 80,000 soldiers plus 40,000 conscripted Okinawan civilians under his command, had no intention of defending beaches where American naval guns could obliterate his forces, and instead he had withdrawn his entire army into the southern mountains of Okinawa, where they had spent 6 months digging an intricate network of caves and tunnels that would turn the island into a fortress designed not to win the battle, which everyone, including Emperor Hirohito himself, knew was impossible, but to inflict so many casualties on the Americans that the cost of invading the Japanese mainland would seem politically and militarily unthinkable. Okinawa was critical to American strategy for 2 reasons. First, its location, just 700 kilometers south of mainland Japan, made it the perfect staging ground for the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, with enough space for massive airfields that could support continuous bombing campaigns and enough harbors to accommodate the largest invasion fleet ever assembled. And second, capturing Okinawa would sever Japan's supply lines to its remaining colonies in Taiwan, China, Singapore, and throughout Southeast Asia, strangling an island nation whose economy depended entirely on shipping. The American force committed to this objective was staggering: 1,300 warships, including 12 aircraft carriers and 7 battleships, code-named Operation Iceberg, supported by a ground force under 3-star General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., who commanded the 10th Army. And facing them was not only the 32nd Japanese Army, but an entire civilian population that had been subjected to months of propaganda telling them that American soldiers were rapists and murderers who would torture them to death, and that dying by their own hand or fighting to the death was the only honorable option. While the ground invasion on April 1st met almost no resistance, the naval forces offshore immediately encountered a threat that would haunt them for the entire campaign: the kamikazes. Japan no longer had enough fuel, high-performance aircraft, or experienced pilots to conduct conventional bombing operations, so the General Staff had made the decision to recruit teenagers with as little as 10 to 15 hours of flight training, load their planes with explosives, and simply crash them into American ships, turning young men into guided missiles in what the Japanese called a special attack, but what Americans recognized as organized suicide warfare. What began as a desperate tactical improvisation became a campaign of systematic suicide attacks that would sink or damage over 30 American destroyers and kill more than 5,000 sailors while wounding another 5,000, making Okinawa the costliest naval battle in United States history. And the psychological impact on American sailors was devastating, because unlike conventional bombing, where you might see a distant aircraft dropping ordnance, the kamikaze attacks were so close and so personal that sailors could actually see the faces of the young Japanese pilots in the seconds before impact. And those images of teenage boys deliberately flying to their deaths haunted survivors for decades afterward. American sailors learned to dread the sound of air raid sirens because they knew what was coming, and they watched helplessly as aircraft carriers, which were not particularly well armored, took catastrophic damage from planes that conventional anti-aircraft fire could not always stop in time. And the attacks came not only from the air, but also from small suicide boats called shinyo, explosive-laden vessels manned by single operators who would ram American ships in the darkness, targeting ammunition transports in an attempt to cut off the supply advantage that made American forces so formidable. On April 6, 1945, just 5 days after the initial landing, Emperor Hirohito ordered Operation Tengo, a final desperate gamble that would send the pride of the Japanese Navy, the battleship Yamato, on a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa. The Yamato was the largest battleship ever built, 863 feet long, displacing 69,000 tons and mounting 9 18-inch guns that were larger than anything in the American arsenal. And it was a symbol of Japanese naval power and national pride. But by April 1945, it was also the last major warship Japan possessed, and the plan was to sail it to Okinawa with just enough fuel for a one-way trip, ram it onto the beaches, and use its massive guns as stationary artillery to shell the American invasion fleet. The problem with this plan was that American radar pickets and submarines detected the Yamato as soon as it left Japanese waters, and Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the American Pacific Fleet, had no intention of risking his battleships in a surface engagement when he could simply overwhelm the Japanese task force with carrier-based aircraft. On April 7, 1945, American carriers launched 386 fighter planes that descended on the Yamato and its escorts as they sailed south without any air cover whatsoever. And despite the battleship's formidable anti-aircraft defenses, the sheer number of attacking planes was overwhelming, and within hours, the Yamato capsized and sank north of Okinawa, taking all 3,000 crew members to the bottom of the sea. And the largest battleship in the world, which had been built at enormous cost and represented years of Japanese industrial effort, went down without ever firing its main guns in anger, a complete and total waste that symbolized the futility of Japan's strategic position. 5 days after the sinking of the Yamato, on April 12, 1945, the American forces on Okinawa received stunning news from home. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had died suddenly at his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia, and while troops across the Pacific paused to mourn their commander-in-chief, the Japanese propaganda machine immediately seized on this event, dropping leaflets over American positions that read, "To all American officers and men, we must express our deep regret over the death of President Roosevelt. The American tragedy is now raised here at Okinawa with his death. You must have seen 70% of your carriers and 73% of your battleships sunk or damaged, causing 150,000 casualties. Not only the late president, but anyone else would die in the excess of worry to hear such annihilative damage. The dreadful loss that led to your late leader's death will make you orphans on this island. The Japanese Special Attack War will sink your vessels down to the last destroyer." The numbers were completely fabricated, but the message was clear. The Japanese forces intended to fight until every last soldier was dead, and they wanted the Americans to know it. While the northern part of Okinawa fell relatively quickly to Marine divisions, who encountered only scattered resistance and captured the Motobu Peninsula and the small island of Iishima by late April, the southern advance immediately ran into the Shuri Line, a network of fortified positions in the mountainous terrain where General Ushijima had concentrated the bulk of his forces in tunnels and caves that were nearly impossible to destroy with conventional weapons. The Americans found themselves fighting a gruesome war of attrition, where every ridge, every hill, every cave had to be taken individually through brutal close-quarters combat involving flamethrowers that burned defenders alive in their tunnels, satchel charges thrown into cave openings, grenades lobbed back and forth in confined spaces, and often hand-to-hand fighting with knives and rifle butts when ammunition ran out, and places with names like Kakazu Ridge, Sugarloaf Hill, Horseshoe Hill, and Half Moon Hill became synonymous with slaughter, as soldiers measured progress in yards rather than miles, and it often took days or even weeks to capture a single position that might be only 100 meters across. On April 24th, after 2 weeks of continuous assault, American forces finally seized Kakazu Ridge, a position only 100 meters long, breaking through the first Japanese defensive line. But there were 2 more defensive lines waiting behind it, each as heavily fortified as the last, because the Japanese strategy was never to win, but simply to make the Americans pay such a heavy price in blood for every foot of ground that the thought of invading mainland Japan would become politically and militarily unacceptable. The fighting in the hills around the Shuri Line was unlike anything American forces had encountered in the Pacific War, more reminiscent of the trench warfare of World War I than the island-hopping campaigns that had characterized the previous 3 years, and the casualty rates reflected this reality as soldiers lived in mud, endured constant artillery fire, and watched their friends die for gains that could be measured in single meters. In early May, General Cho, the aggressive chief of staff of the 32nd Army, convinced General Ushijima to abandon the defensive strategy that had been working and launch a counter-offensive with 3,000 men supported by tanks against the center of the American lines, while simultaneously attempting an amphibious assault on the rear coast. The counterattack was a complete disaster, as Japanese soldiers came out of their protected tunnels and caves into the open where American artillery and air power could annihilate them, and the amphibious force was destroyed at sea without a single survivor reaching shore. And this one mistake, abandoning the defensive strategy for a single day, accelerated the Japanese defeat by weeks and gave the Americans the opening they needed to finally break through the Shuri defenses. On May 17, 1945, after weeks of the most intense urban combat, American forces captured Naha, the capital of Okinawa. But the battle was far from over, because the Shuri Castle, sitting atop a mountain riddled with defensive tunnels, remained the heart of Japanese resistance, and as American forces moved to surround it, the weather turned against them. Heavy rains transformed the battlefield into a sea of mud that was several feet deep in places, making it nearly impossible for vehicles to move, for supplies to reach the front lines, or for aircraft to provide support. And both armies found themselves paralyzed by conditions that favored the Japanese defenders, who were protected in their caves while American troops were exposed to the elements. Finally, realizing that the castle was surrounded and the battle was lost, General Ushijima ordered his forces to retreat south on May 28, 1945, and the next day, American troops raised their flag over Shuri Castle. But even this victory could not stop the nightmare, because the Japanese forces had withdrawn to the southern tip of the island, where they would make their final stand. The civilian population of Okinawa, which had been subjected to months of propaganda and indoctrination by the Japanese military, faced an impossible choice as the American forces advanced: surrender to soldiers they had been told would torture and murder them, attempt to escape across a battlefield where they would likely starve or be killed by artillery fire, or follow the orders they had been given and commit suicide rather than face capture. The Japanese military had distributed propaganda pamphlets months before the invasion describing Americans as barbaric rapists who would torture prisoners to death, and they told civilians that jumping off cliffs or using grenades to kill their entire families was preferable to the horrors that awaited them in American hands. And tragically, many Okinawans believed this propaganda because they had no reason to doubt their own military's warnings. The result was one of the greatest civilian tragedies of World War II, as entire families killed themselves in caves using grenades that had been distributed specifically for this purpose, or by strangling each other with ropes, or by jumping together from cliffs in organized mass suicides that left American soldiers traumatized by the sight of hundreds of bodies at the base of precipices. Japanese soldiers who were retreating south often forced civilians out of protective caves at gunpoint, taking their food and leaving them to die in the open. And in some cases, soldiers actually killed civilians who refused to commit suicide or who attempted to surrender to the Americans, seeing them as traitors who had violated their duty to the emperor, and those who survived described having to abandon elderly relatives and wounded family members who could not keep up as they fled across a landscape of mud and devastation where every step might trigger an artillery shell or landmine. American forces dropped leaflets promising that surrendering soldiers and civilians would be treated humanely, including testimonies allegedly from captured Japanese soldiers saying that the Americans provided food and medical care, but years of propaganda could not be undone by a piece of paper. And while some civilians did eventually surrender and were shocked to discover that the Americans were actually helping them rather than harming them, tens of thousands chose death instead. As the battle entered its final phase in June, American forces pushed the remaining Japanese defenders into the southern tip of the island, fighting for positions like the Oroku Peninsula and the Kunishi Ridge, where resistance was fierce but ultimately futile. On June 18, 1945, General Buckner, who had commanded the entire American invasion force, made a visit to the front lines to observe his troops, and in a moment of terrible irony, just as victory seemed certain, he was struck by shrapnel from Japanese artillery fire and died from his injuries within minutes, becoming the highest-ranking American officer killed in combat during all of World War II. 3 days later, on June 21st, American soldiers discovered the body of General Ushijima in a cave on Mabuni Hill, and he had committed ritual suicide through seppuku, disemboweling himself with a sword while an aide cut off his head, fulfilling what he saw as his duty to avoid the dishonor of capture, even though he knew the battle was lost. And before his death, he had ordered his remaining men to fight to the end and never surrender, ensuring that the slaughter would continue until the last possible moment. On June 22, 1945, after 82 days of combat that had killed 12,500 Americans, wounded 35,000 more, destroyed over 100,000 Japanese soldiers, and most horrifically claimed the lives of approximately 150,000 Okinawan civilians, roughly one-third of the island's entire population, the Battle of Okinawa was officially declared over. The United States had achieved its objective of capturing a staging ground for the invasion of mainland Japan, but the cost had been staggering. And when American military planners looked at the casualty figures and then looked at their plans for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, scheduled for November 1945, they realized with horror that if defending a single island 700 kilometers from Japan had cost this many lives, then invading the main islands, where the entire Japanese population of 70 million people had been told to fight to the death, would produce casualties that might exceed 1 million American soldiers. The Battle of Okinawa had demonstrated with brutal clarity that the Japanese military and civilian population would resist an invasion with fanatical determination, regardless of the hopelessness of their situation. And this realization, combined with the recent successful test of the atomic bomb, led directly to President Harry Truman's decision to use nuclear weapons against Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945, bringing World War II to an end without the need for the invasion that Okinawa had shown would be unimaginably costly. The island of Okinawa itself was devastated beyond recognition, with 90% of its buildings destroyed and centuries of cultural heritage reduced to rubble. And after Japan's surrender, the American military established major bases on the island that remain there to this day, with Okinawa being returned to Japanese control in 1972, but still hosting 70% of all United States military facilities in Japan, despite representing less than 1% of the country's total land area. The residents of Okinawa, who suffered more than any other civilian population in the Pacific War, have never forgotten the 82 days when their island became a battlefield that killed 150,000 of their people, and the memory of that nightmare remains vivid in a place where the scars of war have never fully healed, making Okinawa a permanent reminder of the terrible human cost of the deadliest battle of the Pacific and the last major ground campaign of World War II. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more history content covering wars, revolutions, and events that shaped the modern world.